I began to learn the shady history of Nootropolis shortly after my week-long holiday in the Blue Pens. Most events happened before my time, but I was soon to get swept up in the events which had transformed this radical, free-thinking utopia into the polluted pit of boredom it is today. Something was up with the population, something unnatural and sinister. My life and theirs were about to change forever. I'll start right at the beginning.
Today's ancient DOS game is anything but its namesake. Normality is one of the most bizarre and imaginative games out there, mainly because it follows that old saying, everything you know is wrong. One of the first ways you'll know you're in for a wild ride is when you pick up a pair of scissors that have been sitting in the same place for so long that they've left a permanent bald patch in your carpet. Or even one of the first puzzles you have to solve is to use a pecking bird toy to continually push a button on a remote control to keep your faulty television on because the normal thing to do is to watch TV all day long. Yeah, it gets even more wacky as you progress, and while the quality is almost flawless, there are a few glaring issues later in the game that can ruin the mood. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, let's go over the game stats. Normality was developed by Gremlin Interactive and published by Interplay in 1996. It's a one-player, first-person, inventory-based adventure game. You know, the kind where you pick up objects, use them on stuff, and watch what happens. Its graphics support is complicated. All of the graphics modes the game uses are 256 color, and it supports standard VGA 320x200 resolution for the main game menus and loading screens, but also supports SVGA 320x400 for the gameplay only, and SVGA 640x480 for the menus only. So basically, if your system had SVGA support, you could set the game to SVGA mode and get higher but different resolutions for the gameplay and menus, yet still be forced back to the VGA mode whenever a loading screen needs to be displayed. So essentially you're switching between three resolutions as you play. Not often, but often enough that it might get irritating. That said, the game will still run perfectly fine without an SVGA card, and doing so means that everything that can happen will happen at the standard VGA 320x200 resolution. Yeah, as I said, it's complicated. The game supports multiple sound and music cards as well, so choose whichever card sounds the best on your system, or works at all. I couldn't get the Gravis Ultrasound or Sound Blaster 16 support working, and the Sound Blaster Pro supports only mono and not stereo for some obscure reason. As for the game's release date, it's still commercial, but finding a copy in places like Amazon or eBay isn't too difficult. They just don't show up in large quantities. That said, you shouldn't expect to pay more than about $10 to get a copy in new or like new condition, unless you're also getting the original box in the process. So the story is surprisingly comprehensible considering how abnormal this game really is. Basically, you play the role of Kent Knutson, a resident of Nootropolis, a very normal city that's slowly but surely being turned into a place devoid of free thinking and excitement by its ruler Paul Nistelux. Due to, unfortunate circumstances, Kent was arrested one particular night for whistling while walking down the street. I'm willing to bet that's actually happened somewhere in the world before. His punishment was to spend a full week inside a place referred to as the Blue Pen, basically a blue steel jail cell where they pipe in lousy music to try and normalize an individual. On his last day there, someone slips a note under the door telling Kent to get a job at and snoop around the Plush Rest factory to find some like-minded people, and thus the quest begins. Now, there's two things I like about this game right off the bat. The first is that everything is voice acted, and the voice of Kent Knutson is actually done by Corey Feldman, who'd done plenty of voice acting work prior to this game, so his performance is very good, albeit a little exaggerated at times, though perhaps that was on purpose. And since Kent's voice is the one you hear for 95% of the game, it's kind of important that it sounds good. The other vocal talents are passable, certainly could be much worse, and not really that bad, with a couple exceptions, such as the employee in the grocery store who seems to hate life. But then the game's so offbeat, it's hard to tell sometimes when a performance is bad on purpose, or if it's just bad to begin with. Oh well, you take what you get, really. The other thing I like about this game is that despite how ludicrous it can be, the puzzles aren't actually that difficult, so long as you keep two things in mind. One, most of the puzzles require combining items, and two, you don't necessarily have to pick up an item to use it as if it were in your inventory. A good example of this is right at the beginning where you have to boil a kettle, then fill a coffee mug with it. But Kent doesn't want to add the kettle to his inventory, and when you go to use it, you use it as though it actually were an inventory item, clicking afterwards on the object in the world or in your inventory that you want to use it on. There's a few items like that, so always keep that in mind. The free-roaming nature of the game is primarily what set it apart from similar games of the time. Most inventory-based adventure games up to that point were all either single screens that would transition between each other, or various spots chained together that you could look around from, then click to move fixed distances to the next spot you could look around from. In Normality, the levels are made using a sector-based approach and filled with sprites to represent the various characters and objects, much like first-person shooters of the time, thus you have total control over where you walk and where you look. This also means you sometimes have to be a little clever to find things. For instance, in the mall you can get a screwdriver, but it's hidden on the floor behind a nearly shut door, so you can't be too close that you can't see it, but you also can't be too far away that you can't reach it. One failing of the game is most of the inventory items you pick up only really have one use, the matches and guitar being two very important exceptions. And in fact, even though I've beaten this game twice, I still don't know what's the purpose some of the inventory items serve. More glaring than that, though, is that there's a point in the game when much of your inventory is lost. Under most circumstances, this wouldn't be too big an issue, but because you can permanently lose important items this way, that you might still need later on, a lot of bug-fixing changes had to be made at the last minute, and you'll know if you're encountering an inventory item or situation that's been affected by these changes, because there'll be no voice acting. These moments stand out severely considering the level of quality that's gone into most of the game. Not all of the game, though. For instance, there's a place later in the game called the Ordinary Outpost, and much of what you have to do there is not very well explained, to the point where you can actually get yourself stuck because you forgot to write something down in real life. Yeah, one of those issues. A game should always be fully contained, and with this one exception, this game is. So forgetting to write this one thing down and not having a save game since before you're given this information basically prevent you from progressing. Now granted, we have the internet now and said information is readily available online, but imagine playing this game back in 1996 when it was new and the internet was still in its infancy. You'd be screwed. You'd have to pretty much start the entire game over. For this reason, I recommend keeping multiple saves. The game actually has 99 save slots, so there's no excuse not to. Now, because of the nature of this game, I can't really say too much about the content itself without spoiling things, and that's why I'm only showing the first few sections you can visit. Though what I will tell you is that after that inventory losing point I mentioned, there's actually a divergence in the path of the game, giving you two completely different paths to take, which don't last too long before merging back into the same path, but it's neat to find something like that in a game like this, considering most similar adventure games only ever really have one path, no matter how long or how far you play it for. This is also a game where observation is essential. You're going to quickly know while looking around that there's detail everywhere in some of the most unlikely of places. For instance, there's a music store inside the mall, and in order to solve a particular puzzle, you need a particular piece of music. The characters give you clues as to what kind of music it would be, if you could, well, actually even call it music. But lo and behold, if you scan across all the different albums in the music store, there's lots of them, and they're all different. So you'll eventually find one that fits the clues you've been given, and you can pick it up. This kind of detail's all over the place, including pieces of artwork, posters, LED displays. Heck, here's another one that's far less obvious. When you're at the Plush Rest factory, there's a particular room with a bunch of lockers in it. When you take a look at the lockers, Kent says most of them are locked, but surely one of them will open. The thing is, when you go to open them, he says the exact same thing for every locker, they just won't open. And it really does look like all the lockers are just one big texture. But if you persist and try opening them all, you will eventually find one that opens. It's hard to really classify the difficulty of this game. Most of the puzzles are pretty simple. It's the lack of information about exactly what you have to do that's going to stump you. For the most part, the characters talk a lot, but say little. Most of the information they give is backstory, not advice, so you're going to have to be a little ingenious about how you approach the various problems. Some of them don't even have an answer and are just there to tease you, like the Norm that's blocking the basement area of the Plush Rest factory. You will not ever get by that individual. Yet there's so many options for dealing with him that it almost seems like it should be possible. Heck, Kent even makes a few fourth wall jokes as you progress, such as the line, "Why are all the interesting places locked?" Or, "Not so much a window, more a slightly transparent piece of wall." So yeah, Normality is a fun adventure game, and perhaps one of the best inventory-based adventures ever made, even if it can be frustrating or misprogrammed at times. If you're not prepared to suspend your disbelief to the extreme though, you're probably not going to like it. The humor is extremely bizarre, despite the fact almost everyone in the game takes it to just be normal. And, wait a minute. Does that mean the title of the game is not really about a city that's being drained of free thinking, but more so the fact that everyone in the game thinks all the abnormal stuff going on is normal? You know, there's so much cleverness to this game that I'm willing to bet that some of it was accidental, like the title. In any case, let's bring this episode to a close. DOSBox settings are once again a piece of cake. Well, once you get the game working. Just set the cycles to max and turn off the graphics scalers. Since the game comes on CD though, to reduce the loading times it's best to create an image of the CD on your hard drive, then use DOSBox's image mount command to mount the image file instead of your actual CD. Then you just need to do a minimal install of the game and it should run full speed with minimal loading times. And that's all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. Stay tuned for episode 27, where we're going to take a look at a game with bubbles. And unlike almost every other game with bubbles, your objective isn't to pop them, but to save them. If you know what game that is, then send your guess to adg@pixelships.com and tune in next Saturday to see just what kind of game it could possibly be.